Well, this morning we're wrapping up. This has been a haywire way to start. We're wrapping up this series that we've been in for the last several weeks, and all of this is based on the words of Jesus from John chapter 15. And these are some awesome words when you really think about what they're saying. And here's what he says. Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples." And we've been talking about how Jesus is calling us to a life of fruitfulness. But that life, he tells us, is absolutely contingent upon one thing, that we somehow learn to abide in him. And so as we've talked about throughout this series, kind of a theme that just has cropped up is the importance of rest in the process of abiding. Because in a culture where like busyness is a fetish, where stillness is considered laziness, many of us face this constant nagging inner voice. And I would guarantee that many of you in this room feel this all the time, where this voice is saying to you, okay, you don't have time to rest. Okay, you have way too much to do. Look at all the stuff on your list that isn't done. You don't have time to be unproductive. Okay, you better get something done. And so even when we're not at work, ultimately we're not at rest. Now, we've already looked at the reality that this is absolutely not God's desire for us. This pressure that we feel to produce something every moment of every day, wherever it is that comes from, it isn't from God. In fact, God actually commands us to rest. He commands us to stop producing. Like one day a week, we are to take a complete break from production. This is actually one of the 10 Commandments, and we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, but I want us to wrap up this series by coming back to it, at least at the beginning this morning. So here we go. This is commandment number 4. This is Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, okay, one of the 10 Commandments. Moses says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." And it's interesting because when you think about the journey of Israel, Moses receives the 10 Commandments at what point in the journey? At the beginning. Okay? It's at the very beginning of Israel's journey, right after they get out of slavery in Egypt. And so you think about this. They have never, for how long were they enslaved in Egypt? 400 years. Okay, 400 years as a people they were enslaved in Egypt. They have never experienced anything like a Sabbath. They've never experienced a day off. They were being worked literally to death, and that was the goal of the Egyptians, was to kill some of them off by working them to death. Okay, no breaks, no day off, no weekend, nothing ever for your whole life. Imagine that. So the concept here of Sabbath, as Moses is laying this out for them, is a brand spanking new idea. And God says, look, this goes all the way back to the beginning. This goes all the way back to creation. For in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Now, the picture is that we imitate God. We imitate what God did on the seventh day. We cease, we rest. Now, obviously, God didn't rest because he was tired. God didn't wear himself out with all the work of creation. God doesn't wrestle with this like an obsessive bout of workaholism. He's not at risk of burnout or, breakdown. God isn't like desperate for the weekend. God isn't going, thank me, it's Friday. Okay, thank you. This is more, thank you. This is more a picture of God sort of taking the lead by example. It's like a parent that is coaxing a toddler to nap by laying down beside her. It's as if God sort of woos us by resting himself. Okay, this is the idea that's being communicated here in Exodus. But at the end of Israel's journey, 40 years later, after wandering through the desert, after experiencing all kinds of ups and downs, just before they're about to enter the land, Moses once again addresses the nation of Israel in Deuteronomy. And he gives this sort of like State of Union address. And he comes back to the importance of Sabbath. But this time he paints a little bit different picture. This is Deuteronomy 5:15. He says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So Moses is saying, like, guys, remember slavery in Egypt. Okay, you were denied any choice when it came to rest. You worked all day, every day. The Egyptians put taskmasters over you with bullwhips to ensure it. But God went to extravagant lengths to set you free. Like he parted the Red Sea. You guys remember that? He parted the Red Sea, and then when those taskmasters came chasing after you, he closed the sea and he swallowed them up. And so Moses is warning them. He's like, don't resurrect the taskmasters. Don't go back to the sea now and throw lifelines to them. Don't rescue them out of the sea and invite them to go on into the promised land with you. Okay, learn to do Sabbath. Learn to rest. Don't put yourself back into slavery, because slavery to production will kill you. It'll kill your body and it will kill your heart. Mark Buchanan, who writes a lot about Sabbath, writes this, and we looked at some of his stuff a few weeks ago, but he writes this. He says, one measure for whether or not you're rested enough, besides falling asleep in board meetings, is to ask yourself this: how much do I care about the things I care about? When we lose concern for people, both the lost and the found, for the bride of Christ, for friendship, for truth and beauty and goodness, when we cease to laugh when our children laugh, and instead yell at them to quiet down, or weep when our spouses weep, and instead wish they didn't get so emotional, when we hear news of trouble among our neighbors and our first thought is that we hope that it isn't going to involve us, when we stop caring about the things we care about, that's a signal that we're too busy. So I just want to pause here and ask you to do a little self-evaluation. How much do you care about the things you care about? Like, does serving someone, your kids or your spouse or a neighbor, is that something that like makes your pulse race with excitement? Or honestly, does it make you want to run away and hide? Because I'll tell you what, that's not God's desire for you. His desire is for your heart to come fully alive, for you to be bursting with passion and energy and hope and optimism, for you to sense his presence with you, for his heart to be like flowing into yours, for you to see the world the way that he does, and for his kingdom then to come to the world through you. And this is why getting refreshed like every single stinking week is a really big deal to God for you. This is why the Sabbath is actually one of the 10 commandments. It's because we aren't wired to be productive every moment of every day for 7 days a week, week after week. The rhythm of Sabbath is essential for the abiding life that Jesus is inviting us into. And so what I want to kind of do is spend a few minutes here this morning, kind of close this thing down by talking a little bit more practically about Sabbath. Because I think there's a lot of things. You look in our culture, and it's difficult, isn't it, for us to practice Sabbath in our culture? You think about Israel, and you go, it would have been so much easier for them because the whole nation did it. Right? Like everything shut down on that day, and they all practiced this together. And if you weren't practicing it, they'd drag you out back and stone you to death. So it was like, no problem. But for us, like, okay, we live in this world where stuff is happening all the time. We're invited to do this. We're asked to do that. We have to commit to this thing, that. How in the world do you practice Sabbath in the culture that we live in? And so there's a lot of questions around this. There's no way I can possibly address all that, but I want to get practical and talk with you just about some of the basics of Sabbath keeping. And I want to start by giving you two things that will sabotage your Sabbath. Okay? And the first one is legalism. There is something in us when, just as human beings, when we hear the words, the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord, on it you shall do no work. And the million-dollar question for thousands of years has been, well, what constitutes work? And so, not surprisingly, by Jesus' day, there was an extensive code for the Sabbath. Like the rabbis, for hundreds of years prior to Jesus, had created rule after rule after rule, hundreds and hundreds of rules about the Sabbath, what you can do, what you can't do. And so, what did Jesus do? Well, he very publicly kind of went down the list and just started breaking all the rules. Like one time, for instance, he's in the synagogue, basically in church, on the Sabbath. And we're told that Jesus healed a man with a shriveled hand. And it sent the religious watchdogs into a frenzy, right? This is Mark 3:6. It says, then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus for healing a man's hand. Now, two things are really striking about this. First, the Pharisees and the Herodians, you guys all know about the history between the Pharisees and the Herodians? Yeah, okay. So the Pharisees and the Herodians were like the two major political groups, and they hated each other. Okay, they despised each other. Pharisees were like, just think of them as being like crazy conservative, and the Herodians were like ultra liberal. And each party represented to the other everything that was wrong with Israel. And yet we see them here come together and unite over a common enemy, Jesus. Jesus had so thoroughly offended both groups that they actually link arms to figure out how to plot his death. Okay, the second striking thing is that they plot murder on the Sabbath. So I find that ironic. As they see it, healing on the Sabbath is an affront to God, but plotting murder is perfectly acceptable. And you get into that, you go, that is the absurd blindness of legalism. I mean, legalism is like, it's an adventure in missing the point. It's elevating rules over the heart of the matter. And legalism, like, leads to bizarre lines of reasoning. And legalism will choke the life and the joy out of Sabbath. So I want to come back to our very simple definition of Sabbath. What is Sabbath? And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Part one is cease from what is necessary. And part two is embrace that which gives life. It's pretty simple. So when it comes to any activity, as you're thinking through, is this an acceptable thing to do on the Sabbath? We just run it through that filter. Cease from what is necessary. Embrace that which gives life. Is it okay to bake cookies on the Sabbath? Well, is it necessary or does it give life? Is it like an ought to or a get to? What kind of cookies are they? Is it okay to send emails on the Sabbath? Is it okay to weed the flower bed? Is it okay to work on the car? Same filter. Okay, does this smell like an ought, or would it be a life-giving thing to do? Maybe I think of someone that I love, I send them an email to tell them how much I love them. Awesome. Maybe I'm looking through my emails and I got like one of those hot emails in my inbox of someone that hates me, and I think, well, maybe I don't want to respond to that on the Sabbath. We kind of like things to be black and white, can or can't. But if you look at the Sabbath, it's amazing how in the scriptures, the way to practice it is left really vague. God keeps it so open-ended. And yet God gives very explicit instructions about other things, certain things like priestly garments, very specific. Dietary concerns, very specific. The removal of mildew, very specific. Types of polyester that are forbidden, okay? Very specific. But for the Sabbath, God gives, this is interesting, he gives very little detail. Just mostly guidelines. And they're basically this: cease from work, celebrate, remember God, and rest. Like Sabbath keeping is really, if you think about it, it's more art than science. It's a whole lot more poetry than math. It's kind of like a dance, and you have to feel it. I once heard someone say it this way: that Sabbath is like cake, and you don't need a bunch of rules to experience it. You just need a fork. So the first way to ruin your Sabbath experience is to get all legalistic. Okay? But there's a second thing that you can do, second approach that will also ruin it. And I'll say it this way: justificationism. Most of us have this innate ability, just hardwired into us, to justify just about anything. Like, can I mow the lawn on the Sabbath? And I go, well, sure I can if it gives me life. Okay, so then maybe I spend hours and hours mowing the lawn, and the truth is, it's depleting me. I'm not doing it because I get to. I'm not doing it because it gives me life in some way. I'm doing it because I ought to. Like, I'm afraid of what happens if I don't. And when I'm done with all of that, then I go and I pay bills. And then I go grocery shopping for the week. And what I say to myself is something like, well, I'm sure glad that I'm not one of those like judgmental, legalistic, closed-minded Sabbath people. Because man, is it ever good to get all of this stuff checked off my list. It clears my mind, it sets me at ease, and besides, if I didn't get it done, I'd have to do it next week, and then like that would deplete me all week. And the truth is, this whole justificationism, we're just kidding ourselves. By the end of the day, by the end of our one Sabbath day, we're exhausted, we're not refreshed, and then we're back to our everyday life, and we've lost it. And the reason that I can tell you about this is because I've done this. I mean, I have wasted away my Sabbath. And when I start doing this, I'll tell you guys, man, I feel it. Like I stop getting passions from God. I stop caring about what I care about. And even though my life might be filled with all kinds of positive activity, I'm actually very often not accomplishing the stuff that matters most. Okay, I'm not the husband that I want to be. I'm not the dad that I want to be. I'm not the friend that I could be. I lose passion and vision and creativity for what's going on at church. And there's like serious consequences to this. And my guess is that in this room, most of you, when you think of Sabbath keeping, you're going to tend to err one way or the other on this. Some of you, you'll go the legalism route and just kind of shred yourself with all these rules you got to follow. Others of you will go the justificationism route and just justify away why you're not getting any rest, why you're not taking a Sabbath. The thing is, God wants you to be refreshed. And either one of these routes will ruin it. So, like, you got to be careful. Okay, let me shift into three positive things. Shift gears and talk about a few things that are helpful. Just valuable ingredients for a restorative Sabbath. And the first one is play. For some of you, the word Sabbath in and of itself, it just sounds dry and boring, doesn't it? You just go, Sabbath. Like, it's just like, who wants that? Isn't it just like Sabbath? Like Sabbath. I mean, like, because you're probably like envisioning monks like sitting in a like brick room somewhere chanting or whatever, and like for you it's just what you envision is hours of prayer or reading or singing, and honestly there's nothing wrong with all of that. That can be very restorative. But for some of you, you look at that and you go, okay, where I'm at in my life right now, that doesn't fire me up. That doesn't produce a lot of passion. And if that's all there is to it, if that's the only option, the Sabbath itself starts to feel like a big chore. It starts to feel like a big ought to. And it's interesting because a lot of people have, for whatever reason, through the centuries, have removed play from the Sabbath. One of my favorite movies of all time is Chariots of Fire. How many of you have seen that? Okay, a few of you that are over 40. It's based on a true story. And the story is that it follows two Olympic sprinters from Britain in the 1920s. Okay, like I said, true story. And one of them is this guy named Eric Liddell. And he is a devout Christ follower. In real life was a devout Christ follower. In fact, he was a preacher preparing to become a missionary. And there's this scene where when he gets done preaching, it's Sunday, and he's walking along and he's talking with people after the message, and a soccer ball rolls up to him and hits him in the leg, and it's, of course, got a kid behind it. So Eric Liddell, he picks up the soccer ball, and he hands it to the kid, and he tenderly says, "The Sabbath's not a day for playing football, is it?" And the kid kind of looks up at him sheepishly with embarrassment and says, "No, sir." And I remember seeing that, and now I think about that years later, and I go, that's a common way of thinking about the Sabbath. Later in the movie, there's a second scene where Eric Liddell's confronted by his sister. And she's convinced, because she is a completely devoted Christ follower, she's convinced that because of all of his attention focused on Olympics and running, he's wasting his life. He's forgetting about his ministry. He's forgetting about God. So she's kind of giving him the business. And he says something awesome. He looks at her and he says, "I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." And that was just like an epic line in the movie. It's like, oh man, is that awesome? When I run, I feel his pleasure. Now, I saw that movie when I was like 9. And I was so inspired by that line and by just the music and so I decided to become a runner. And so when I got home, I just went out into the yard and I ran. And I made it like 3 minutes, and then I decided, okay, when I run, I don't feel the Lord's pleasure. And so that was the end of that. And I stayed with baseball, where you stand in one spot. But for him, you go, how beautiful is that? Okay, I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. Now, the tension of the whole story and his whole, really, that period of his life centered around the Sabbath, because Liddell is an Olympic, his Olympic race gets scheduled for, does anybody know what day of the week? Sunday. And so guess what? Because of his view of the Sabbath, he refuses to run. And his commitment to God in this whole thing is staggering. Like, his willingness to stand by his principles is incredible. And in the end, one of his teammates is so moved by all of this that he offers to switch events with him. And of course, Liddell is such a ridiculous athlete. And again, this is a true story, that he wins gold in an event that isn't even his. But here's the striking thing to me. As I think about all that and I process it, I go, okay, while I admire his commitment to his faith, while refusing to put even Olympic dreams above God is unbelievably beautiful, why couldn't he run on the Sabbath? Really? I mean, if when he runs he feels God's pleasure, then what in the world is wrong with doing it on the Sabbath? And somewhere along the way, it became off limits to have fun on the Sabbath. And I think we're all wired differently. So I don't know what causes you to feel God's pleasure. But whatever it is, try to work it into your Sabbath. I mean, do you like riding quads or motorcycles? Do you like riding horses? Do you like to go for hikes? Do you like to water ski, snowboard? You like to play chess? I mean, what is it that helps you feel alive? What is it that helps you feel God's pleasure? Do you like to fish? Do you like to go for long walks? Do you like to knit? What is it that causes you to feel God's pleasure? What is it that you don't normally get to do during the week that you could carve out a day and make that a part of your Sabbath? I mean, what is it that would get your pulse racing and just get you anticipating it? Whatever that thing is, or whatever that group of things are, try to get them on your list. Get them on the agenda. The question sometimes comes up, and this is kind of tricky, for like stay-at-home parents. Right? Because if you got little ones at home and that's your life, it's easy to kind of look at that whole thing. You just go, look, okay, my full-time job is basically to raise and care for my kids. How is the Sabbath day any different than any other day? Like, leave me alone, kids. It's my Sabbath day. Well, that is an issue. It's true. But I'm going to throw something out there, and maybe I'm wrong on this. I've never really been a stay-at-home parent. I'm just throwing this out there. But I would bet that most days include more than just being with your kids. I bet they include things like laundry and cleaning and running errands and a whole host of other stuff. So here's my thought from a non-stay-at-home parent. On the Sabbath, as much as you possibly can, free yourself from all the rest of it. Like, set all that other stuff aside. Find ways to play with your kids, to do stuff as a family, to release yourself from all the have-tos, and enjoy your spouse and your kids as much as you can by investing yourself in the get-tos. Here's the thing that I wish we could do as a family, but we haven't had time, or we haven't had the ability to do this. Use the Sabbath for that. Maybe think about something you'd love to do with your kids, something you don't normally have time to do, and then you go do that, and you enjoy it, and you enjoy the kids. Okay, so play is a really important ingredient. Second ingredient, doing good. Now, I want to revisit the story of Jesus healing the man with a shriveled hand. I want to look at it as it's told in Matthew chapter 12. It says, going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there, looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. They asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Guys, that's funny. I mean, we read the words of Jesus, we're like, that's funny. If any one of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Yes, it's okay to do good on the Sabbath. Yes, it's okay to heal on the Sabbath. Jesus is saying, look, it's okay to serve people and love people on the Sabbath. Like, even if you have to expend some energy, loving people is always a good idea. And this is important. I think there can be a lot of confusion around this. A couple weeks ago, I quoted Mark Buchanan, and I'll quote him again. He said, Sabbath is a complete and total reprieve from what you ought to do. Even though the list of oughts is infinitely long and never done, oughts are tyrants, noisy and surly, chronically dissatisfied. Sabbath is the day you trade places with them. They go in the salt mine and you go out dancing. It's the one day when the only thing you must do is not do the things you must. You are given permission, issued a command to be blunt, to turn your back on all those oughts. Now, again, the idea is cease from what's necessary and embrace that which gives life. Trade the ought-tos for the get-tos. Find ways to do the things that breathe life into you. Okay, organize your day around stuff you can't wait to do. And you look at this and you go, this is beautiful. This is freeing. This is something to anticipate every week. This is a breath of fresh air. But I want to make sure that we don't, like, in thinking about this, mishear what's actually being said here. Because it's easy for us to kind of hear this, and there's a part of our human nature that wants to turn it into something like this. The Sabbath day is a day to be unapologetically selfish. It's the one day of the week that can be all about you. So don't ever make any commitments. Don't ever agree to do something for another person. Don't ever agree to having to be somewhere. Because what if later it turns out you don't want to do it? The key to a successful Sabbath is to avoid everything that isn't totally and completely 100% about you. It's a full day of unadulterated selfishness. So just in case there's any confusion, that's not what I'm saying at all. Jesus said, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. In other words, it's a good idea to love and serve people. It just shouldn't be like your regular job. It should be different. When he says keep the Sabbath day holy, what does holy mean? It means set apart. It should be set apart. It should be different than your regular work week. But according to Jesus, we actually get refreshed. We should be getting refreshed if things are happening right when we love people. And for most people, Sabbath is most naturally practiced on Sunday. And so questions come up sometimes. Stuff like, okay, well, but if I'm helping in like children's ministry, or if I'm serving in some other capacity, that's not really the Sabbath, right? No. It's actually good to serve and to love people, okay? And not just at church. Like, it's a good idea to help someone in your family on the Sabbath, a neighbor, a friend. And if you're doing it with the right attitude, it should be done with joy. Now, because ministry usually, for me, takes my entire Sunday, because usually by the end of Sunday, Jen and I are utterly exhausted, because it is, in a sense, our job, we do what pretty much all pastor couples do. We take a different day for our Sabbath. Now, some pastors take Friday or Saturday. We take Mondays. Most of you know that. But I want to say that doesn't mean that we don't ever make any other commitments on Mondays. In fact, for years, when Cam was growing up, in the winters, I coached his basketball team on Mondays. I coached with another person. Mondays were the only day we could get a gym. Okay, I coached basketball every Monday in the wintertime. And I made a decision that I would do that, and I would take part of my Sabbath day to build into these boys. And for me, it was a project that I did with God. And I did it because, for me, when I coach, I feel his pleasure. But that required commitment. It required that I be somewhere. But it was very different from what I do as a pastor. It was a way to do good. It was a way to love and serve. And I did it because it is perfectly okay to do good on the Sabbath. Now, it needs to be refreshing. It needs to not be your normal job. But serving those around you is a good idea. So, let me just, as a hot tip, give you some things you should never say on the Sabbath. This may save your marriage. Sorry, hun, I can't rub your aching back. It's my Sabbath, you know? Sorry, babe, can't do dishes on the Sabbath. Sorry, my son, my 1-year-old son, can't change poopy diapers on the Sabbath. Smells like an ought. Or worse than that. Or sorry, can't ever serve in ministry on the Sabbath. It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Okay, last thing. Key ingredient is connecting with Jesus. Okay, a really important part of the Sabbath is connecting with Jesus in some way. And for most people, most of you, your Sabbath day is going to be Sunday. That's natural for most of you. If you're not working regularly on Sundays, you can organize your life around that. And that means you can do church, and you can be in community with other people, and you can connect with Christ. Connecting with Jesus is a really important part of this abiding thing that we do. And I just want to close by asking you, how you doing? Like if Jesus promises that the supernatural power of God will infuse us to produce fruit that we could never produce on our own, that we will understand things we couldn't understand, we will care about things we wouldn't care about, we will invest ourselves in things that we wouldn't have invested ourselves in, and God will be with us, empowering us the whole way to make our life matter. This is what the abiding life does, is it produces fruit. How are you doing in the abiding part of this thing? Like, are you staying connected to Jesus? And we had a meeting with our board the last time we met, and was talking to them about their summer plans. And it was interesting because we're in the middle of the summer, man. And if you're somebody who goes, my Sabbath experience is that I take a day of rest for the most, try to organize around that. But I also go to church, and so I'm connecting with Christ there. But then you go, okay, but in the summer, I'm gone, and I come to church like 3 times the entire summer. And you go, So are we taking a vacation and abiding with Christ, or are we taking a vacation from Christ? And that brings me to a whole nother thing with this. Like, we think about abiding as this Jesus is like, I'm inviting you into this relationship with me to have my life. If you connect to me like a branch connects to a vine, I'll pour my life into you. I'll pour energy into you. I'll pour passion into you. I will pour love into you, courage, wisdom. And it's interesting because a lot of times I think when we think about Sabbath or we think about abiding in Christ, we think about connecting to Him. For a lot of Christians, whatever the process is of doing that feels like an ought. Like, I think about this and I go, and I'm looking at myself, I'm looking at my own heart, I'm looking at the people around me, I'm like, why is it for us that this feels like an ought? This feels like an ought to and not a get to. Like something's going a little haywire here. And so I'm kind of just talking from the heart here as I close this thing out. But I just want to ask you, when you think of your relationship with Jesus, is this something that you have to force yourself to do? Or is it something that you can't wait to do? And if it's something that you have to force yourself to do, something's going haywire. Something's a little bit off. And what do you do about that? I don't know. But I know that if that's the situation, we got to look at that and go, what in the world is happening? If Jesus is willing to pour this into me and love me and show me grace for everything all the time, why would I dread that? Why would I look at engaging with Him as an ought to in my life and not a get to? So I was thinking about this, and we were talking about it with our board, and one of the guys is going to be gone basically all summer. He's going to be in Europe. And so I went around, and we do a devotion at the beginning of our board meetings, and so I said, well, okay, I read this passage, the John 15 passage. I said, what do you find as the most significant practice in helping you stay connected to Jesus? And people said various things. Multiple people said prayer. I need regular prayer. A couple of them said, I need to be reading something. I need to be reading something that challenges me and inspires me and kind of stretches my mind. Then one of the people said, the most significant thing in my life that I found, the number one practice for me staying connected to Christ is being at church and worshiping at church. I was like, that's awesome. I take personal responsibility for that. But you're going to be gone in Europe all summer. So how's this going to work? And he kind of laughed. He goes, oh, yeah. He said, well, I'm going to have to fill that with some other things. And so I'm planning to read some stuff. I'm planning to engage in some other practices. And it was a really healthy discussion. And so I just want you to think about you. Like, we don't have to think of a plan for the next 20 years, but as you think about the next maybe 2 months, what's your plan for connecting with Jesus? Because most of you are off on vacations and you got a lot of stuff going on, and that is awesome. God bless you in that. What's your plan for connecting with Jesus? So we put this together a few weeks ago, and this is in the back on the information table. It's a summer of abiding, and it's got a beautiful picture of grapes. And so I know that in and of itself will be inspiring if you just look at it regularly. But on the inside, there are a few different ways that we're just throwing out as suggestions for how you might connect with Christ over the next few months. One of them is a way to read the Bible and work your way through what it's saying to you and try to listen to what God is saying to you. It's called soaping. And then we've got a prayer guide for just kind of a way to be talking with God on a regular basis. And then I've got a suggested summer reading list with a bunch of books on it, things that I've read over the last couple of years that I think are great. And they've got descriptions. And if you've got something you're reading over the summer, awesome. But if you're not going to be around church or you're not going to be real regular with other spiritual routines, here's what I've seen. People that read over the summer get infused. It's the most amazing thing. Like they can have a lot of other disruptions to their normal routine, but if they're reading something, if their mind is engaged in something, it's amazing what God does with that. And Jen and I, with our own Sabbath stuff, over the last few years, we've been like, man, we're spending the day, we're taking the day off, and we're resting, and we're doing more of the get-tos and less of the ought-tos, but are we connecting with Jesus? Because we don't have church to go to. If our day is a Monday, it's real easy for the day to just kind of go by, and there's really no Jesus part of it specifically. And so we decided to start, just make sure that we're reading together on that day and talking about it, and if it feels right, we'll pray through what we're reading or talking about. And we're currently reading this book called Unfinished. And this is by Richard Stearns. He's the president of World Vision. He lives in Bellevue, and our mind is being blown by this. So if you don't know what else to read, I would suggest this is on the reading list. But we started reading that on our Sabbath days, and it's been hugely helpful for us. And I just want to close, you guys, and say, Jesus has so much for us if we will abide, if we will stay connected to him. But you've got to figure out what that looks like for you. You've got to figure out how to make that a priority for you. And I just encourage you, don't let the summer go by and just waste this opportunity. This is time for most of us when we get more rest, more time off of work, more time to take a break. And let's have that be a break with Jesus, not a break from Jesus.